Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Steinberg Halion 7 tutorial series. Today we're going to have a look at the architecture of how a sound travels through Halion, from the concept of libraries right up at the top of the structure, all the way down to layers, which are the smallest individual component of sound. If you're enjoying this series and you'd like to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. It's an awesome way to do it. Okay, so today we're going to start in the media bay, which is on the right hand side of our interface. And I'm just going to pull this curtain back a little bit. I'll press the control key down so that none of the rest of the interface gets messed with. And we've got 5 icons across the top. At the top of the media bay, we've got some filters that allow us to search for sounds. There are thousands and thousands of sounds in Halion, so we're going to use these filters quite a lot. I'm actually going to search for the hexagon preset, but I'm not going to do it by name. Let's say I've forgotten its name and I'm searching for it by character. The first filter that I'm going to apply to this search is the synth type. I know it's a synth. We've got 3 different kinds of synths to play with: pads, leads, and comp. Comp is a bit of a catch-all situation. It's basically anything that isn't the other 2. If it's a typically monophonic sound or quite harsh or fast attack, it's likely to be synth lead. Synth pads are generally quite slow and evolving sounds, and comps are literally everything else. So let's take a punt and presume that it's a synth comp setting. You can see this little blue box appear, and the list of libraries down below has dramatically shrunk. So everything that you can see now is a library that contains a synth comp preset. It's basically been filtered down. Let's keep going though, because we also remember that it's an arpeggio sound. Now, any preset can have property tags assigned to it, and we can filter by property over here. I'll drop this little box down, get one of the ugliest selection boxes you'll ever see. It doesn't matter how big you make this properties box. When I pull this little drop down arrow down, the list inside remains fixed. It's like, no, that's not good enough. I'm going to choose arpeggio and say OK. And that filter has been added to the synth comp. So now you can see we've got quite a small list to choose from. I'll add one more as well. So inside synth comp, which is the parent category, you can have multiple subcategories. Digital and analog is a very common division. If I click on the all libraries icon to get me to a text-based list, then all of the available filters at that level, because I don't know where in Halion I'm looking, so I'm looking across the entire suite. You can see that 3 of the entries in this attribute list have tabs in them. We've got synth comp, digital, other, and analog. So Halion is constantly, depending on what filters you've applied, it's basically suggesting a sensible next step. So I'm going to choose the analog subcategory. And now a quick glance down this list. I've suddenly remembered that hexagon is the preset that I'm looking for. So I can now double click it in the media bay. At the moment we have this strings sound loaded. Just keep an eye on the slot and the program table as I double click this item. So it's now being loaded into program table entry number 1 and slot number 1. So let's have a talk about those 2 concepts. The program table it's just a glorified notepad really. It's a holding area where you can put presets. Nothing special's done with them, with one caveat. Basically, it's just a place where presets are stored. So I could drag any number of presets over into the program table. So I'm clicking and dragging now. I'm pulling these things across. They're not having any impact on Halion. They haven't been loaded into memory. The one caveat that I mentioned is that the program table responds to program change numbers. It's not something I want to concentrate on right now. It's a little bit more complex than we're ready for at the moment. But a little bit later on in the episode, we'll have a look at how we can send program change numbers and they correlate to these table entries. But basically, to all intents and purposes, treat this thing basically just like a storage bay. One other feature that you need to be aware of with the program table is that although you can single click and drag any item into an individual slot in the table, if I select program 12 down here and then double click an entry in the media bay, you might think it'll actually be loaded into program 12, but it won't. It'll go into the first available empty entry in the table. And at the moment, that's going to be program 6. So I'll just randomly double click one of these. Digi Orchestra Sphere is going to head into program number 6. There we go. So the program table is pretty lightweight and pretty transparent. The really important stuff is done in the slot rack. Now, for the past few minutes, I've been concentrating largely on the program table and talking about that. But up above in the slot rack, Different behavior has been occurring depending on whether or not I double clicked or dragged. The two presets that I double clicked, which were hexagon and the orchestra sphere, have been automatically added into the slot rack. In other words, both of these presets are now loaded into memory and they are good to go. Hexagon is communicating on MIDI channel 1 of port A. I've got this MIDI cable icon and then A1 next to it. This is telling you that Halion has 4 ports available to it. This basically gives you a total of 64 independent MIDI channels. Basically, a port contains 16 MIDI channels. Halion is configured with 4 separate ports. These are input ports. So all ports in the MIDI protocol are either input or output. They're never both. And at the moment, we're talking about input ports here. So this is information coming from the outside world, in other words, Cubase in this case, into Halion, instructing Halion to do something. Any information that Halion receives on channel 1 of port A is going to be routed to the hexagon preset. The second preset, however, the orchestra sphere, is communicating on channel number 2. Same port, both port A, but channel number 2. Let's have a look at what that looks like from the perspective of Cubase. So here's our instrument track. Now, instrument tracks hide quite a lot of the feature set of MIDI, and it can be a little bit confusing to understand what's going on, because when you have a look in the inspector, you can't see that there are 4 ports here. All you can see is that it's communicating on MIDI channel 1. The best way to get a true picture of what's actually happening is to create yourself a MIDI track instead. Both MIDI tracks and instrument tracks communicate with the same plugin instance in exactly the same way. They're just different ways of viewing the same information. MIDI tracks are dedicated to handling MIDI, and they actually present a cleaner and more accurate view of what's going on as far as the MIDI world's concerned than the instrument tracks, which hide a little bit of that. When you create a MIDI track in Cubase, it automatically increments the MIDI channel number, which drives me crazy. I'm going to set it to MIDI channel 1. This MIDI track, communicating on channel 1, is talking to Halion on port A. Now you can see the real picture behind the scenes. So here's our 4 different communication ports, and this track is assigned to port A. What that means is when I press a key on the keyboard, you're going to hear the hexagon preset. If I change that MIDI channel to 2, now we're going to be sending it to that orchestra sound instead. Let's go back into Halion, see what's going on there. 2 different presets communicating on different MIDI channels. I'm just going to shrink my Halion instance a little bit so that you can see that MIDI track above. What I'm going to do now is change orchestra sphere to communicate on MIDI channel 1 instead. So now both presets are listening on channel 1. When I press a key on the keyboard, it's going to output a MIDI channel 2 message. And here you can hear me pressing the key and you're not hearing anything. It's talking on the wrong channel. If I switch to MIDI channel 1 instead, what it's now going to do is route that information to both instruments simultaneously. And it's just a little bit loud. There we go. And you can see the green indicators in the slot rack telling you that information is being routed in via our MIDI ports. On the left hand side you can see our green MIDI in lights, and on the right hand side the signal being output. This is also an excellent illustration of the fact that the entry in the program table has got nothing to do with the MIDI channel. These are just storage slots. Next to the MIDI channel number in the slot rack, we've got this note symbol with an infinity. This is the polyphony. At the moment, both of these presets are polyphonic, so if I press a chord, you'll hear everything. I'm just going to mute the sphere. I'll mute it from the slot rack. Now we'll just hear hexagon. I'll play a 3-note chord. Now it's playing that 3-note arpeggio with the pad chord behind. However, if I click on polyphony and set it to 1 instead, I've just made that instrument monophonic. Play the same chord. Now every one of those notes is being played individually. Switch back to infinite again, fully polyphonic. There's the pad chord. Probably easier to hear with the orchestra sound actually. It's doing exactly the same thing. Here's our polyphonic sound and monophonic. So it's only playing each one of those notes individually. There's my C, there's my E, and there's my G. There's obviously an octave bounce in there as well, isn't there? Very cool. It's a good sound, that. Output routing is probably a little bit beyond us today, but we do have the option to configure to any one of our 32 outputs. The vast majority of the time, you can basically leave that outputting to output number 1, and everything is going to be totally fine. But I'll give us a tiny glance of our output routing from the perspective of Cubase. Jump back up to the instrument. This is where you manage output routing. It's got nothing to do with MIDI tracks. It's on the instrument track itself. And there's a little icon in the inspector that says activate outputs. And here you can see the 32 outputs. Only one of them is currently enabled, which is why when we look at it in the mixer, you can only see one track. If you wanted to create a new output routing, this is where you would do it. And now a new channel appears. Information can be routed to either of those outputs. It's a little bit beyond today's brief. Let's stick with programs for today. Now then, can you see all of this rubbish that's appeared in the program table? I want to get rid of all of that. The easiest way to initialize Halion back down to a completely default state is right at the top of the interface. There's this box called Drop Multi-Program here. It's basically a selection box. A quick definition of what a multi is basically everything you can see. All of the programs collected in the program table, all of the instances of the presets in the slot rack, everything is the multi. Don't particularly need to worry about that today. But what I actually want to do is throw the whole thing away. If you right click on this box, you get this option to clear plugin instance. This is the easiest and fastest way to set Halion back to a completely empty state. Click this option. You get this message pop up saying, are you sure you want to do this? You're going to throw everything away. Say yes. And now Halion is completely clean. I'm going to get us back to having a look at Hexagon again. This time I'll just search for it by name. And I'm going to double click it to load it back into slot 1. That's all very well and good. When I press a key on the keyboard, you're going to hear it. But there's more that you can do from the media bay than just load programs, because you can load individual layers. You might recall from episode 1 when we had a look at the program tree. Hexagon is actually made up of 3 separate layers: Anima, Skylab, and Studio Strings. Each one of these little sandwich icons represents one of those layers, and they're all individual, completely self-contained sound generation units. The layer is the smallest sound generation unit that can be configured in Halion, and we can actually load individual layers into slots as well. Over in the media bay, just above your output list, you'll see this little icon that says Show Program Structure. Click that, and now this new box has appeared. I'm going to pull the curtain to the left a little bit so that we can see it a little bit more clearly. And now if I single click on Hexagon, it's going to reveal the program structure to you, and here you can see the individual layers. So what I'm now going to do is load the Anima layer of the Hexagon program directly into slot number 2. So I'm going to pick it up, I'm going to drag it over into the slot rack, and I'm going to hover over the plus icon. You can see that red box appear. If I let go now, Halion has automatically created an entry in the program table, because you can't have something in the slot rack that isn't in the program table. It's a necessary prerequisite, and it's automatically assigned it to MIDI channel number 2. It'll be interesting in editing to see why on earth Aged Suitcase is on the right hand side. Maybe I inadvertently clicked, I don't know why. But anyway, if I now head over to my MIDI track and select MIDI channel 2, now when I press a key, you're just going to hear the Anima element of the Hexagon preset. Let's drag Skylab across into slot number 3 and change the routing from Cubase. It's quite quiet, but that's quite clearly the Skylab layer of the Hexagon program. So it's really cool that you can load individual components of these sounds into their own slots. Pull this curtain down so they've got a bit more area to play with in my slot rack. Now I'm going to create a 4th entry in the slot rack, but I'm not going to do it from the media bay. I'm going to right click on the plus icon, and I get this option called Init Program. This is really, really useful. Again, it's another one of those shortcuts to get you where you need to be as quickly as possible. If you're building a synth sound from scratch, you don't want to have to go through the hassle of creating an entry in the program table, creating an entry in the slot. You can right click on the slot rack, init program, and whatever type of synthesis sound you're looking for, let's just create an analog synth because that's the simplest. I'm going to select that. That's created a clean, freshly initialized analog synth to play with. Let's have a look in the program tree what it looks like. Analog synth layer, and here is our analog synth zone. If I want to press a key on the keyboard and hear this thing, what am I going to have to do? I'm going to have to change my MIDI track to channel 4. There's my simple sine wave analog sound, and I'm going to be able to edit that and do whatever I want with it, but that's the fastest way to create initialized sounds and get them straight into your slot rack as quickly as possible. Okay, so here we are with 4 sounds in our program table, and at the moment they're all occupying their own slots, and that's absolutely fine. I could create 4 separate MIDI tracks in Cubase, talking on MIDI channels 1, 2, 3, and 4, have that communication, no problem at all. I'm going to right click on slots 2, 3, and 4 and get rid of them. Now I should be able to say reset slot. Unfortunately, it appears this functionality doesn't work at the moment. I've got no idea why, but you can cut program. You just have to go through this annoying question asking if you want to remove it from the program table. So that's the fastest way that I know of to remove individual slots out of Halion at the moment. Hopefully they'll fix that eventually, because that's annoying. Now I'm just back to a single instance of Hexagon on channel 1. Now I'm going to show you how the program table links into the slot rack via program change messages. In order to enable this feature, there's one prerequisite. You have to go over to your options section. Wherever your options editor is, find it. Head into the MIDI controller section, and there's this feature called receive program changes. You need to turn that on. By default, it's not on. Now if I output program change messages from Cubase on MIDI channel 1, containing program change numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, it'll dynamically update this slot and load the appropriate sound into slot number 1. I'll show you how I do that. Create a MIDI track, double click into it. You can do this from the list editor as well. There's any number of ways to do all of these jobs. I'll zoom in, and I'm going to create 4 program change messages, one at bar 9, 13, 17, and 21. I actually find it easier to just click anywhere on the correct place, and then this value here, you can see where I'm hovering over with my mouse, that's actually going to be the program change message. So we start off at 1, we change this value to 2, the next one is 3, and finally 4. Okay, so here we are back in Cubase, having created those 4 program change messages. Just bring this up a little bit so that you can see them at the bottom of the screen. When I press play, just keep an eye on the slot rack, and every 4 bars, this slot is going to get updated with the entry from the program table. Here we go. So obviously we start off with Hexagon on channel 1 for the first 4 bars, and now it's going to switch to Anima now. There we go. And you can see loading Anima just to prove that the entries aren't in the program table intrinsically. There's Skylab. And finally, in 4 bars time, the init analog synth will be loaded. And there we are. So that's the only genuinely significant link between the entries in the program table and the slot rack. Other than that, the 2 concepts are completely unrelated. You can actually load more than 128 programs into this table. Why on earth you would want to, I have no idea. But if you do, only the first 128 will actually exhibit this behavior. One other feature of the program table is this icon called preload. If I select preload for the sample-based instruments, it'll basically load those samples into memory. So if you want to do your program change switching and you have preload engaged, it just means you're going to be faster doing that switch on the fly. Now, I'll be absolutely honest with you, I don't use program changes anymore. This is a feature from the MIDI protocol that I think was rendered redundant 20 years ago. So I don't know why anybody would want to work this way anymore. But if you do, if you want to have your entire song loaded into a single instance of Halion, talking to multiple different slots and changing programs on the fly, be my guest. That just sounds completely unnecessary to me, but I thought it was important to show you this stuff because it gives you not only a historical context for why lots of these features exist, but also kind of a better understanding, I think, of the architecture. Why have we got slots and program tables and programs? Well, now that you can see the different levels of hierarchy, hopefully that's a little bit more kind of meaningful to you. Finally today, saving. You can right click on a layer and save that individually. Save layer as. You can save a layer as a full program. Alternatively, if you just want to save the program as a program, you do that from the top of the program tree. There's a little save program button here. And at each of these different levels, you can specify all of those categories and subcategories and properties. You can do all of your tagging here. Obviously give the thing a name as well. But you can also save the entire instance of Halion. When we had multiple things loaded in our slots earlier, like this, if I wanted to save that whole feature set as a multi, in other words, a multi-program, then the Save Multi-Program As icon at the top left-hand corner of the application is the way to do that. Exactly the same features, whether you're saving as a layer or a program or a multi, you're going to get the same options available to you. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.